Everyone thought Florida was the escape from high costs, but it's quietly becoming one of the most expensive places to live. That's the contradiction. Florida still sells the same dream. Lower taxes, warm weather, more space, a better life. But for a growing number of people, the math no longer works. The state is still gaining people overall, yet something underneath has changed. The wave that made Florida feel unstoppable is slowing down. The rush is not gone, but it is no longer the same. And the reason why is the real story. For years, Florida looked like the answer to a very American frustration. People were tired of expensive housing, tired of state income taxes, tired of long winters and crowded cities. Florida offered the opposite. No income tax, new subdivisions, bigger homes, beaches, sun. It felt simple. And remote workers saw freedom. Families saw more house for the money. Investors saw momentum. And after 2020, that image got even stronger. Florida didn't just look attractive. It looked like the obvious move. On the surface, that story still seems true. Florida is still growing. It still pulls in huge numbers of newcomers. From a distance, it can look like the boom never ended. But the deeper story is different. The people who once moved there for a cheaper, easier life are not arriving with the same confidence. And that shift matters because it points to something bigger than a normal housing story. Florida stopped feeling cheap. Not slowly, fast. And faster than people's assumptions could catch up. In a lot of Americans' minds, Florida still sits in the category of affordable Sun Belt state. But prices moved faster than the reputation. Home values jumped, rents climbed, property taxes became harder to ignore, and even when the market cooled, the monthly cost of staying in Florida often did not cool with it. That is the trap. The entry price might soften. The carrying cost often does not. And that leads to the bigger problem. The one a lot of people only discover after they arrive. In Florida, the affordability crisis is not just about the home price or the rent. It is about everything attached to it. Insurance, HOA fees, condo assessments, utilities, maintenance, storm exposure, car insurance, taxes. People move thinking about the listing price, then get hit by the total cost of ownership. That is where the dream starts to crack. And because once all those costs stack up, Florida stops feeling cheap and starts feeling unstable. That word matters, not just expensive. Unstable. Because once insurance enters the picture, the entire equation changes. Florida is not expensive in the normal way. It is expensive in a volatile way. In many places, housing costs rise because demand rises. In Florida, housing costs can rise because risk rises. Storm exposure, insurance stress, reinsurance costs, market instability. All of it flows into what people pay just to keep a roof protected. And those costs do not always rise smoothly. Sometimes they jump. So even if your mortgage stays the same, your monthly reality does not. And that is where the contradiction gets sharper. Florida still looks affordable on paper. No state income tax. That is the famous selling point. That is what people remember. But people do not live on paper. They live on monthly payments. And when those payments start climbing from every direction, insurance, HOA, utilities, car insurance, repairs, the tax advantage stops feeling like a breakthrough. It starts feeling like a slogan. The brand says low cost. The lived experience says unstable cost. Then there is the condo problem, and this is where the story stops feeling like inflation and starts feeling structural. After the Surfside collapse, Florida forced many condo buildings to deal with realities they had delayed for years. Inspections, reserve studies, repair funding, structural work. Costs that once stayed in the background suddenly moved to the front. That may be necessary for safety, But financially, it hit like a shockwave. Because a lot of buildings were never truly cheap. They were underpriced relative to the work they still needed. So what happens when stricter rules collide with higher insurance and years of deferred maintenance? The bill arrives all at once, and for many owners, that bill is brutal. HOA dues rise. Special assessments show up. Reserve contributions jump. A condo that once looked like a bargain starts acting like a liability, not because the purchase made no sense at the time, but because the true cost was delayed. That is the part many people outside Florida miss. A lot of residents are not leaving because their homes became worthless. They are leaving because ownership became unpredictable. And once ownership feels unpredictable, the psychology of the market changes fast. Zoom out for a second, as because this is where the bigger pattern comes into focus. Florida is not just dealing with a cost problem, it is dealing with a risk pricing problem. For years, the state grew faster than its long-term costs were fully priced in. People saw the upside first: sunshine, lower taxes, growth, opportunity. But the deeper costs, climate exposure, insurance pressure, infrastructure strain, long-delayed maintenance, showed up later. Florida did not suddenly become expensive. It gradually stopped hiding the bill. And that helps explain why the migration slowdown matters more than it seems. Florida is still growing, but if fewer domestic movers are choosing it as the obvious escape, then the old value proposition is weakening. The person leaving New York, New Jersey, Illinois, or California used to look at Florida and see relief. More space and less tax, lower costs, a cleaner reset. Now that same person has to ask a more uncomfortable question. Is this really cheaper, or is it just cheaper at first? That single question changes everything, because once enough people start asking it, the mood changes. The hype cools. Homes sit longer. Price cuts become more common. The feeling of inevitability disappears. And that emotional shift matters. Real estate is not driven by numbers alone. It is driven by stories people believe. For a long time, the story was simple. Move to Florida and improve your life. Now the story is getting messier. And there is another layer here. Not financial, psychological. Florida never sold just affordability. It sold escape. Escape from cold weather. Escape from high taxes. Escape from expensive cities. Escape from stress. That promise is powerful, because people do not move for spreadsheets alone. They move for identity. They want to believe they are making a smarter move, a freer move, a move toward a better version of life. That is why disappointment hits harder here. When costs rise in places everyone already expects to be expensive, it feels annoying. When costs rise in the place that promised relief, it feels like betrayal. The state that was supposed to simplify your life starts producing more bills, more uncertainty, and more fine print. And hidden costs are often worse than obvious ones. Everyone expects New York City to be expensive. Everyone expects coastal California to be expensive. Those places come with a warning label. Florida often does not. That is what makes this story so sticky. It is not just about price. It is about surprise. Florida was supposed to be the alternative. That belief still exists, which means a lot of people are still using an old map to navigate a new reality. So the real question is not whether Florida can keep growing. It probably can. The real question is whether it can close the gap between perception and reality. There are efforts to build more housing. There are policy changes. There are attempts to stabilize insurance markets. There are signs that some parts of the rental frenzy have cooled. Those things matter, but they do not erase the larger issue. Florida's growth model now runs straight into the cost of resilience, the cost of safety, the cost of maintaining what was built during the boom. And those costs do not disappear. They accumulate. Which leads to the most important insight in this whole story. Population growth and affordability are not the same thing. A place can look successful from 30,000 feet and still feel financially exhausting on the ground. Florida can keep attracting newcomers, keep building, keep expanding, keep making national headlines, and still quietly lose the exact kind of person who moved there expecting relief. So when people say, everyone was moving to Florida, that part is true. But when they assume the story stayed simple, that is where they get it wrong. Florida did not stop being desirable. It stopped being straightforward. The question is no longer just, can you afford to move there? It is, can you afford what happens after you arrive? And that is why some people are quietly leaving. Not because Florida collapsed overnight, not because nobody wants to live there, but because the most painful part of the cost is often the part you do not fully see until you are already committed. From a distance, Florida still looks like the answer. Up close, for more and more people, it feels like a very expensive surprise.